They said it wouldn't get worse, they said it would calm down, they said the legal mess was already boiling over, but nothing, and no one could have predicted the exact moment Candace Owens stepped out with that fire in her eyes and that paper in her hand. A defamation suit that was supposed to shake her silence ended up shaking the ground under Hollywood as most polished darling Blake Lively, because this wasn't just a lawsuit, this wasn't just a celebrity spat, this was Candace calling out every whisper, every headline, every well-timed Instagram post, and the way she did it shocked everyone, because it wasn't rage, it wasn't tears, it was calm, composed, and terrifying. Candace wasn't just fighting back, she was dragging the whole facade into the light, and what she revealed about Blake and her hidden media fingerprints turned gossip into gasoline, and as social media exploded, no one was more silent than Blake herself. Where was the apology? Where was the clarification? Where was the PR control team who once could spin scandal into style gone quiet, missing completely? And it wasn't just the silence that stung, it was the timing. Candace's response hit right after Blake's team was accused of pushing a misleading smear campaign targeting creators on YouTube, and guess what the digital footprints lined up to? Well, like they weren't even trying to hide it, and with Candace's lawsuit came receipts, not theories, not accusations, but hard, sharp receipts, ones that named names, revealed dates, traced IPs, and exposed back-channel deals that made everyone watching take a long, hard breath. Because no, it wasn't about defending yourself, it was about explaining why you tried to ruin someone else's name without expecting them to fight back. And for Candace, this wasn't new ground. She's fought bigger forces, stood taller storms, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the entitlement, maybe it was the assumption that she'd stay quiet, maybe it was the years of coded jabs coming from Hollywood, as elite wrapped in hashtags and filters. Maybe it was just the final straw. But what she did wasn't just respond, she detonated, and in that explosion fans of both women were forced to ask questions no one ever thought they'd say out loud, like had Blake Lively really gotten away with it for this long? Had her spotless brand just been a carefully managed illusion? And if so, how many others were buried under that same smiley sparkle? And as the internet dug deeper, every little clip, every quote, every passive-aggressive interview began to look like something darker, and suddenly Blake's PR hole wasn't just a metaphor, it was real, it was deep, and she was falling fast. Because the more she tried to stay quiet, the louder Candace's side became. People didn't just want an explanation, they demanded one, and the silence was deafening. Even her closest celebrity friends began to unfollow or worse, ignore, and in Hollywood, that's a red flag brighter than a paparazzi flash. And all this while Candace wasn't even doing interviews. She wasn't screaming, she was letting the documents speak, and they did in bold, underlined legal language that couldn't be spun or softened. And when one particular file showed connections between Blake's former publicist and a content farm notorious for launching influencer scandals, things went from controversial to catastrophic. What started as a legal disagreement was quickly becoming the downfall of a brand. And the thing is, Candace wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was opening a door for everyone who had been quietly targeted for not playing by the industry's unwritten rules. And people were watching closely. Creators were speaking out, old interviews were resurfacing, and a narrative was crumbling, one post, one leak, one piece of evidence at a time. And in the middle of it all was a woman known for kindness and poise, now surrounded by questions no PR statement could clean up. And maybe that's why the story caught fire, not because of who was right or wrong, but because of what it revealed behind the glamour, behind the partnerships, behind the friendship bracelets and baby showers. A quiet war had been raging for years, and Candace Owens had finally thrown the first public grenade. The real chaos didn't begin with the lawsuit, it began with the reaction, and not just Candace Owens' reaction, but the reaction of those who had always stayed silent, those who had worked behind the scenes with Blake Lively, those who had seen things, heard whispers, been told to delete emails or look the other way. Suddenly, they were done with silence too, and that's when the walls started cracking, because the public was no longer content with headlines or carefully worded statements. They wanted accountability, they wanted truth, and they weren't willing to let go until it surfaced. And as Candace's team released more layers of the legal documentation, people were stunned at what had been hidden in plain sight, buried under charity events and glowing press releases. Were patterns of targeted discrediting campaigns, passive but effective methods used to create doubt around outspoken voices, and creators who had once posted subtle critiques about Hollywood power were suddenly being revisited. And among the chaos, a chilling trend began to surface. Some of the most vocal dissenters of certain celebrity narratives had all mysteriously had their platforms demonetized, shadow banned, or swarmed by bot-like comment floods, and when investigators connected those patterns to accounts tied to agencies that once worked with Blake Lively, the internet froze. This wasn't just personal anymore, it was systemic, and in that system, Candace Owens wasn't just a target, she was an obstacle to be removed, and that's when the moral complexity hit, because fans were torn. People who had admired Blake for her advocacy, her support for social causes, now found themselves questioning whether those causes were just shields for something darker, and that's a dangerous question for a public figure, especially one whose career has been built on relatability, on charm, on family and friendship and grace, but grace doesn't survive unanswered questions, and this wasn't a minor misstep. This was a sprawling crisis growing wider by the hour, and every attempt to redirect or distract only added fuel to the fire. And then came the turning point when Candace revealed in her filings that this wasn't the first time she'd received anonymous legal threats warning her against speaking out about certain topics, and some of those letters had wording eerily similar to cease and desist drafts that were leaked from Blake's former PR team years ago. And whether coincidence or coordination, it sent shockwaves across legal Twitter, because suddenly the question wasn't just, is Candace telling the truth? It was, who else has been silenced and why? And in that moment, everything changed. This wasn't just a personal legal matter anymore. It was cultural, it was ideological, it was about influence and control and the quiet enforcement of a media narrative. And as more journalists started digging into who had been getting paid to write glowing op-eds about Blake and who had been warned off from investigating certain subjects, the entire ecosystem of celebrity power started to tremble, and the moral question evolved, because it wasn't just about whether Blake had orchestrated a smear campaign. It was whether she had knowingly benefited from one, and whether staying silent made her complicit. And people wrestled with that, because we want to believe in the people we admire. We want to think that fame and kindness can coexist, but the more evidence came out, the harder that got. And for Candace, this wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. It was about not letting powerful people rewrite the truth to protect their brand, and she said as much in a quietly devastating interview, where she explained that silence isn't always peace, sometimes it's fear, and sometimes it's survival. And that's when fans who had never agreed with her politics began to shift, not because they changed ideologies, but because they recognized courage. And there's something powerful about watching someone stand up to a system that's trying to erase them, and in that recognition, a new layer of the story unfolded, because this wasn't just about Candace and Blake anymore. It was about how easily narratives can be controlled, how loyalty is bought, how truth is packaged and sold, and how vulnerable we all are to the influence of glamour and good lighting and perfect captions. But perfection was cracking, and behind it was something raw and messy and painfully human, and the people watching weren't just consuming entertainment anymore, they were choosing sides in a moral battle that stretched far beyond one lawsuit. The moment things truly tipped was not in court and not online, it was in the quiet leak of a private message thread buried in an encrypted app, allegedly between a junior publicist and someone whose name had been redacted from legal filings. And this thread wasn't just damaging, it was revealing. It detailed coordination talks, and not just about Candace Owens, but a handful of other influencers, journalists, and even former brand partners who had either pulled back from working with Blake Lively or raised gentle criticisms about the curated narrative surrounding her career and image. And what made the leak explode was that it used words like neutralize and redirect and cleanse, and those aren't words used in public relations, those are words used in strategy warfare control. And if the messages are verified, which experts say appears increasingly likely, it paints a picture not of a woman caught in a misunderstanding, but of a coordinated system of narrative management. And the public started asking the real question, who benefits from all this, and who has something to lose? And that's when even some of Blake's staunchest defenders began to go quiet, because power without accountability isn't charisma, it's manipulation. And as more of those behind-the-scenes documents came out, emails, chains, internal pitches for crisis PR templates, something darker started to rise. This wasn't just about Candace Owens and her legal team. This was about a decade-long architecture built to protect an image at any cost. And in those documents, it wasn't just Blake's name that kept appearing. It was also references to Ryan Reynolds, to their joint brand deals, their philanthropic positioning, even possible blacklists for journalists deemed too unpredictable or too persistent. And that changed everything, because suddenly it wasn't about one woman's possible mistake. It was about a partnership built on protection and leverage and perception, and that's when the internet split. In two, there were those who still believed that Blake was being unfairly targeted, dragged down for being successful and admired, but then there were those who began connecting dots, who remembered years-old tweets from small creators about mysteriously losing brand deals after criticizing certain celebrities, who looked back at old Reddit threads accusing certain public figures of playing too clean, of having too much luck, of avoiding every scandal, and suddenly those conspiracy-sounding claims started to look less like bitterness and more like breadcrumbs. And when Candace Owens stood on her platform and laid out the dots in a 13-minute, uncut video that cross-referenced dates, messages, and deleted tweets, the internet didn't just watch, it broke. And what made that video undeniable was that Candace didn't raise her voice, she didn't mock or accuse, she simply showed receipts and told her story. And when she ended it with the quiet sentence, "This was never about revenge. This was about truth," it echoed louder than any courtroom shout. In just hours later, news sources began coming forward anonymously, at first then on record, and they all told versions of the same tale. Quiet calls from teams suggesting they take down certain posts, offers to rewrite interviews in exchange for exclusive content, and the most chilling of all, a former staffer from a media outlet confirming that their editor received direct pressure not to run a piece critical of Blake Lively's nonprofit strategy because it might jeopardize ad revenue from sponsors tied to her brand deals. And that was the moment the tone shifted forever, because now it wasn't just a defamation suit, it was a scandal that questioned how much of the media we trust is quietly curated by celebrity influence and money and power. And now fans weren't just wondering who Blake really was, they were wondering who anyone really is in that world where image is everything and truth is optional. And that's when power shifted, because suddenly Candace wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. She was becoming the lens through which the entire system was being re-examined, and in that shift, Blake Lively's team made the mistake of doubling down. Instead of reflecting, they posted a carefully produced video montage of Blake's philanthropic highlights set to soft music with a caption about kindness and resilience, and the comments lit up not with praise but with questions. Real questions, pointed questions. And when those comments began disappearing one by one, fans screenshot everything and posted them elsewhere, and it became clear that the public was done playing polite. And when that public turns, not even the best PR can stop the avalanche from starting. They thought the worst had passed, but what no one realized was that the ground was still cracking beneath them. Because when the fourth anonymous source came forward, not on Twitter, not through an anonymous blog, but live on a broadcast interview with legal documentation in hand, something irreversible shifted. She wasn't a troll or a fan or a jealous former colleague, she was a former senior strategy executive at a brand consulting firm that had worked directly with Blake Lively's team on multiple campaigns. And she didn't just speak vaguely, she gave names, dates, contracts, redacted for privacy, but enough to confirm she was real. And her story wasn't about petty drama, it was about how narratives are manufactured, tested, filtered, and deployed in carefully timed waves. And she said in a calm, unshaking voice that part of her job had been to identify influencers or micro-creators who might pose a future brand risk, and she confirmed that yes, discussions were had about how to manage them or marginalize them, or in some cases discredit them. And the ear left the room, because that was the moment everyone watching realized this wasn't speculation anymore, this was structure. And it didn't matter whether you liked Candace Owens or despised her, the fact remained that a system designed to manipulate public perception had been casually described on live television and tied directly back to the same machine that now stood behind Blake Lively. And the mood online was no longer one of gossip or celebrity shade, it turned to something else, collective reflection, maybe even betrayal. And what came next was like a dam breaking open, because suddenly journalists who'd been sitting on tips felt emboldened suddenly. Bloggers who had been threatened with cease and desist letters for even whispering about certain things felt empowered, and even one fashion editor from a major magazine admitted that they'd been instructed to pull a critical quote from an upcoming piece about Blake's sustainability campaign, because the brand partnership would be worth 7 figures over 2 years. And that's when public trust disintegrated completely. And through it all, Blake remained silent, her team releasing only vague statements about misinformation, compassion, and resilience. But the silence began to sound like confirmation to the public, especially as more digital receipts poured in, old emails, old interviews, side-by-side comparisons of statements that no longer added up, or timelines that now seemed suspiciously convenient. And amidst all this, Candace Owens released another video, this one not slick, not polished, filmed on her phone with ambient noise and shaky lighting. She sat raw and direct and she said, "This isn't about destroying a person, it's about dismantling a system. Because if it can happen to me, it's already happened to dozens of others who didn't have the platform to fight back." And her voice broke just slightly in the middle of that sentence, and people noticed and they felt it, and that one clip was stitched and shared across hundreds of Reels, TikTok shorts with creators, large and small, weighing in not just on Candace, not just on Blake, but on the culture that rewards perfection and punishes transparency. And then something wild happened. A group of creators who had nothing to gain and everything to lose released a joint open letter not condemning Blake Lively the person, but calling for an independent investigation into influencer defamation, suppression, narrative control, and what they called the quiet censorship economy. Within hours, their platforms exploded. Comments or posts, duets, live reactions. The algorithm could barely contain it because something had changed. This wasn't just celebrity news anymore. This was a reckoning, and through it all, Blake Lively's own fan base splintered, some holding on to her carefully crafted image, others posting videos titled things like "I loved her until now," and "Maybe we were all fooled." And the most haunting of all came from a young creator who posted a clip of herself crying softly into the camera, whispering she told us she was different, and that vulnerability, that raw heartbreak, mirrored thousands of others. And for the first time since the defamation case started, the court of public opinion had not only turned against Blake, it had started examining everything surrounding her, the brands that backed her, the friends who defended her, the media outlets that still ran glowing puff pieces amidst the storm. And it was no longer enough to say nothing, because in silence the truth grew louder. And while Blake's legal team tried to reframe the narrative with filings and leaks and sudden media appearances from allies attempting to reset the tone, it fell flat, because by now the story wasn't in their hands anymore. It belonged to the public. The broken trust, the unanswered questions, the erased comments, the perfectly lit video montages all felt like relics from a different era, one where spin could still win. But now, in the age of digital receipts and communal accountability, it wasn't about who had more followers, it was about who had the courage to speak. And in that moment, Candace Owens stood taller than she ever had before, not because she was perfect or always right, but because she didn't flinch. And when everyone else was crafting responses, she told the truth, or at least her version of it, in full, without makeup, without handlers, without a pre-cleared script. And the internet listened. You could feel it in the air, not just on Twitter or Instagram, but in the quiet spaces between news cycles, where something once unspoken was now undeniable, because this wasn't just about Candace Owens anymore, or Blake Lively, or even lawsuits and public image. This was about everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been edited out of the frame, everyone who had told the truth and watched it drown in a sea of curated perfection. And now the silence was breaking in waves. Not anger, not outrage, but reflection, deep, unsettling reflection, because people started asking different questions. What does it mean when narratives are designed in boardrooms? What does it mean when criticism is dismissed as hate and when transparency is seen as weakness? What does it mean when a woman like Blake Lively, who built a career on elegance, relatability, kindness, is now tied to something as dark as defamation, suppression, image manipulation, not because she admitted to it, but because of what kept surfacing, and more importantly, what didn't? And in that stillness came a chilling realization that the people we admire the most, the ones who seem flawless, might be the very ones who've mastered control. So while we forget to ask who's being controlled, and as the defamation case rolled on, as filings stacked up and depositions loomed, a new storm began, one made not of court papers or headlines, but of creators pulling old videos, brand partnerships being reconsidered, longtime fans posting reaction breakdowns with titles like "The Blake We Never Knew" or "Candace Was Right All Along." And that wasn't the story anyone thought would unfold, especially not Hollywood, especially not the PR teams used to playing chess while the public played checkers, because suddenly the public wasn't playing anymore. They were documenting, connecting, piecing together timelines, tracing who followed who unfollowed, when, who liked what before deleting. And what emerged wasn't a conspiracy, but a pattern, and patterns speak louder than PR. And while Blake's team pushed back with official denials, publicists rushed to soften the edges, lawyers filed rebuttals, all of it felt too late, not because she was guilty, but because she didn't understand that in the age of authenticity, timing is truth. And when you wait too long to speak, people fill in the blanks, and the blanks around Blake had grown into canyons. And across those canyons stood Candace Owens, not waving, not pleading, not asking for sympathy, but standing unbothered, unwavering. And whether you liked her politics or not, people started to say one thing: at least she shows up. And it's that phrase that began appearing over and over in the comments sections of videos on both sides of the issue. She shows up, and that became the emotional core of the story, because beneath all the drama, beneath the lawsuits and smears and buried emails, the public wasn't really choosing between Candace and Blake. They were choosing between presence and pretense, between facing the fire or hiding behind the glass, and in that choice, something irreversible happened. The influencer world changed a little. Brands began pausing, reevaluating, not out of fear but out of recognition that the public no longer accepted surface as substance. And as for Blake, something in her silence cracked, not loudly, not in a headline, but subtly: a sudden break from social media, a cancelled appearance, a delayed campaign. And while her team insisted all was well, the fans who once believed with all their hearts began hesitating just long enough to wonder. And that hesitation was everything, because in entertainment, influence, belief is currency, and once it's gone, no lawsuit can bring it back. And as the final week of trial preparation loomed, as the judge issued one last procedural order, as creators everywhere waited for the next shoe to drop, the final twist didn't come from Court or Candace or even Blake. It came from the audience, from a viral clip of a small creator who said quietly, "If this can happen to Candace, it can happen to any of us." And the comments filled with people saying, "I never thought of it that way," or "I feel this in my bones." And from there, the conversation evolved, not about drama but about defense, not about defamation but about dignity. And in that moment, the story became something else. It became a mirror, and as we stared into it, we saw not just celebrities but ourselves, the versions of us we try to present, and the truths we hide, and the pressure to be flawless, and the cost of being real. And as for what happens next, no one knows, because that's the future shock that keeps the story alive. What will Candace do if she wins? If she loses, what will Blake do if the silence ends or continues? And most haunting of all, what will the rest of us do now that the curtain has been pulled back, now that we've seen how stories are shaped not by truth but by timing, and how even the most polished image can dissolve in a single unfiltered moment? Because if Candace Owens taught us anything, it's that the most powerful response isn't rage, it's resolve. And if Blake Lively taught us anything, it's that sometimes silence isn't grace, it's strategy, and sometimes strategy costs more than truth ever would.